Hi everyone. I had a question about capillary filtration, and so I thought I would take a little time to explain this one slide on our PowerPoint. So if you remember how our anatomy and physiology works, we have our heart that pumps out oxygenated blood out of the aorta, and our blood vessels progressively get smaller and smaller and smaller until it reaches the tissue that it's going to feed electrolytes and oxygen and fluid to. So as it goes down to these capillaries, they get really, really tiny, you'll have an arterial side to the capillary and you'll have a venous side to the capillary, and that's where it's going to pick up the waste products and the excess fluid. It's going to pick it up and return it back, and the veins are going to get larger and larger and larger until we get back to the right side of the heart. And that cycle goes over and over. So we need to look at capillary filtration and what makes, on the arterial side, things leave the capillaries, and what makes things on the venous side, things return to the capillaries and then the veins. So we're going to look at capillary hydrostatic pressure. Now, hydrostatic pressure is the fluid pressure in the blood vessels. And if you move to the next slide, you'll see that the hydrostatic pressure is higher. It's like 28 versus like 10 on the other side, the venous pressure. Okay? So this is, we can feel our pulse. That's pressure coming from our volume in our blood, the contraction of our heart, things like that. And this pressure will exert a force outside of the blood pressure, and it will make things seep out through those capillary pores into the tissue. There is some fluid in those tissues, so intrinsically there's going to be pressure coming from those tissues. But you'll notice this arrow is bigger here, so the pressure from the fluid in the capillaries overwhelms the fluid in the tissues, and so you're going to have a net gain of fluid going into the tissue on the arterial side. But when we go into the venous side, that hydrostatic pressure is no longer as strong as the tissue pressure, so we're not going to get that hydrostatic push as much. Instead, we're going to get a pull happening from our capillary colloid osmotic pressure. Okay? What ends up happening is we have things like big proteins like albumin in our blood vessels, and that albumin will attract fluid back into the bloodstream. So that's what's pulling the fluid back into the blood vessel on the venous end. So like I said, hydrostatic pressure is what pushes things out on the arterial end, and then that pressure drops, and so it doesn't push out anymore on this end. But there's a pulling in from that albumin that comes in. Now there is some tissue colloid osmotic pressure as well that's keeping fluid out in the tissue, but overwhelmingly there's more albumin in the blood vessel pulling the fluid back out. And then at the very bottom, there will be some fluid that doesn't get taken back up into the capillaries, and so that fluid will be taken care of through the lymph channel. I'm going to just quickly pop on over to the next slide. So once again, we have here on this slide, it shows that there's capillary filtration pressure. The hydrostatic pressure on the arterial side is 30 millimeters of mercury, and then it drops down to only 10 millimeters of mercury on the venous side. So it's pushing out on the capillary side. And then on the venous end, it's pulling back in with that albumin, and that the interstitial colloid pressure with that protein is only 8 millimeters of mercury in the tissue, so it's much smaller than the 28 millimeters of mercury in the blood vessel. So it pulls on the venous end back in. Okay? And then anything that's not taking up is in the lymph vessels. And then the causes of edema. So if we have increased hydrostatic pressure, if our pressure is just really, really high, of course we're going to have more leaking out, right? Decreased colloid oncotic pressure, if we're missing albumin, we're not pulling anything back in on the venous side. If we have an increase in capillary permeability, that will be something that will really increase the amount of fluid coming out. You don't need as high of pressure for fluid to come out if our capillary permeability, those pores are much larger. We don't need as much pressure. So that would be something like if we have somebody who's got system-wide inflammation that causes those capillary pores to open up. And then lymphatic obstruction, that backup system that we have to take up that extra fluid that doesn't get picked up through the colloid oncotic pressure in our venous system. The lymphatic system will kick in and take up the rest. So if we have a obstruction or a removal of the lymph nodes and lymphatic system in someone like who had breast cancer and they had the lymph nodes removed, they could get lymphedema, the swelling from that. So I hope that explains capillary filtration in a little bit more detail for you guys.